So welcome everybody. You guys are all, we have some current law students, but you can tell everybody else here once was a law student because we're completely lopsided to one side of the room here. Welcome everybody to the inaugural Law and Entrepreneurship Roundtable at the John F. Scarpa Center for Law and Entrepreneurship here at Villanova Law. Really appreciate you all coming. We're going to have a great event, and we are really jam-packed. We have lots of stuff to do, so I'm going to cut it really short and just note with emphasis that this is the inaugural Law and Entrepreneurship Roundtable. The intention is that we're going to do this every year. So look for that next year and the year after and the year after that. Just briefly, I want to thank Dean Mark Alexander. Couldn't make it today, but for all of his support for this program and for the Scarpa Center more generally. Thanks to Veronica Nesbitt and Patty Trask, Samantha Marinelli, Brittany Jackson, Kate Johnson, Joe Mariani, Nicole Garofano. I don't know if she's here. She's an enormous help and for all events at the law school, and she's done a great job with this one as well. And also special thanks to Mike Scully. Well, he's not here anymore. Mike Haney, John Scarpa, Joe Del Rosso, members of the Scarpa Center board. Really appreciate everything you do and have done. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Melanie McMenamin. She's a professor of law here, the director of the Clinic for Law and Entrepreneurship. She does a great job there, and she's assembled a panel here that she'll tell us a little bit more about.
Okay, great. So I'll just begin by echoing Professor Lund's appreciation and excitement, and kick off by introducing our first panel. Our first panel is going to showcase the role of the local nonprofit foundation community in funding social entrepreneurship. Both nonprofit entrepreneurship through innovative models, and we'll also hear about some innovative models that our panelists are using to fund for-profit social entrepreneurship as well. So I'd like to welcome and introduce our panelists. On my far left is Kristina Wahl. She's the president of the Barra Foundation, which is headquartered down the street in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And among her many roles, she's also an advisory board member for Villanova's Department of Public Administration. Moving down the line is Marla Connolly. Marla is a founding partner of the Conley Fleming law firm, where her practice focuses on representing both foundations who fund social enterprise as well as advising the recipients of program-related investments and other funding structures we'll hear about today. Next is Elizabeth Killough. She's the director of the Untours Foundation, which is based in Media, Pennsylvania. The Untours Foundation has a notable distinction of itself owning Untours, a unique travel company that also happens to be the world's first B Corp. We might hear a little bit about that today. And finally, to my left is Omar Woodward, the executive director of GreenLight Fund Philadelphia. Omar has a wealth of experience and perspective on venture philanthropy and nonprofit governance. And welcome to our panelists. And so Marla has agreed to kick off the conversation today by sharing a broad perspective on the evolution of investment activity in the sector. So I'll kick it off over to Marla to do that. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much for having me today. I want to talk about charities increasing their level of sophistication in financial products. I'm an attorney. I represent exclusively tax-exempt entities and donors, and so I'm often handling the tax or financing work for 501c3 entities. So we see charities increasing their sophistication, both as the borrower, trying to find sources of funds for their activities, and then on the grant-making side, also potentially as a lender, looking to lend out to direct service charities and also for-profit organizations to fulfill their charitable purpose. We have a couple of different types of organizations within 501c3. So again, I'm a tax lawyer. For those of you who are looking to do tax law, we're always looking at our specific code sections. So 501c3 generally regulates what these charities can do, both in terms of their borrowing and their lending. My own practice is split really between direct service organizations, so I would consider those to be the ones providing direct services in the community. So I worked for child welfare organizations. Big Brothers Big Sisters was a place I really enjoyed working in the past. That's a direct service organization that has direct programs they're providing. The other half of my practice are grant makers, which tend to be private foundations. Private foundations tend to have a limited number of sources of income, right? So they tend to have their money maybe from one corporation or one family. That's sort of the nature of their structure. Private foundations have a couple of different areas within them. A large private foundation, say an institutional foundation, will often have a grant-making team and an investment team. And those are two completely different groups of people with different skill sets and different budgets within the foundation. So the program team is often looking at financing as an alternative to grant making, right? They see a program they would like to make a grant to, but there's an opportunity perhaps to recover some funds from that grantee, particularly in an investment structure. So for example, in housing, you could just give someone $500,000, or you could loan it to them in a structure that's much like a mortgage. So whereas a traditional grant-making foundation that's interested in housing development might have historically just given blank grants for the development of a particular neighborhood, now they might actually give a mortgage and look to return some money back to the foundation. And the idea is that gives them more money for future grant-making. There's also an idea that the actual borrowing relationship may increase the sophistication of the borrower, and that the grant maker may be able, through some collaborative process, to actually help that grantee achieve a better charitable outcome. So that's one kind of pot of money and one entire section, I would say, of legal structures that we see people using as an alternative to grant making. The other side, on the investment team, these kinds of structures are often an alternative to the traditional investments that make up the endowment portfolio. So a private foundation, usually its investment team, those are bankers, people who come from an investment background, who understand traditional bonds, stocks, what ratio should you have, what sort of risk are you willing to take at different levels in the portfolio. Those people have a very different background, a very different kind of cultural context than your program staff. They also have a different approach when they're looking at investments, considering whether they're prudent, and they expect to make a certain total return overall. So we see a lot of foundations now that are saying there are alternative investment structures where I can make just as much money as I can in my traditional portfolio. There's also this idea on the investment side that your investments could actually undermine your charitable goals and the hard work of your program staff. So the example that seems to be the clearest for people here is perhaps around Standing Rock and the pipeline. If we have a large private foundation, let's say, that's really interested in climate change and really concerned about that pipeline, perhaps they would actually achieve their outcome more by influencing the financial industry, by cleaning their endowment portfolio to remove it from investments in companies that promote the pipeline or underwrite the pipeline, and perhaps that could have a greater economic outcome than the physical people that they sent to Standing Rock to protest that pipeline. So we want to think now about how our investments are actually affecting our charitable purpose and the consequence they're having out in the world that might actually undermine what our program team is doing on the other side. So those are sort of some of the big picture ideas that I see people batting around. I see a lot of interest on the program side about finding ways to make the investments more charitable, and some openness on the investment side that perhaps you don't even have to take a hit on the investment return. Perhaps you can find actual substitutes. And so the legal structures on the investment side are intended to still create a return for the endowment portfolio. I'll start there.
Thanks for that overview. I think next we'll turn to our funders, maybe beginning with you, Tina, to just give us a flavor for kind of within some of these trend lines that Marla outlined. Where does Barra fall, and what sort of new ideas and structures are you pursuing?
Sure. So I'm Tina Wahl from the Barra Foundation, and there'll be three parts to my comments. So one, just to give you some context for our mission and founding. Two, to talk a little bit about our traditional grant making. I think we're probably the most traditional grant maker on the panel when it comes to private foundations. And then third, I want to get into, and I think there'll be some specific examples that will, I think, highlight the two structures that Marla was talking about. The Barra Foundation was started in 1963 by Robert McNeil, who was chairman of McNeil Laboratories. So the idea of our mission to invest in innovation, to inspire change, to strengthen communities in Greater Philadelphia has very much been a part of our culture since the beginning. The idea of thinking about innovation as really intentional innovation, I think certainly it's an overused word, but we think about it from the perspective of our founder, thinking about the scientific method, really creating the conditions for innovation, testing new ideas, evaluating them, and then learning from them. So we do that in three different ways, three parts of our strategy. One is our Barra Awards, which is core support for organizations. That's through a nominating process where we have nominators who identify exemplary organizations, and then those organizations apply. We award 40 organizations $25,000 per year over 2 years. And that core support is intended to provide some breathing room, some flexibility for organizations so that they can perhaps test something. In the for-profit sector, you have some flexible dollars. In the nonprofit sector, you need those flexible dollars as well in order to innovate. The second part of our strategy is our Catalyst Fund, and our Catalyst Fund is what we refer to as our risk capital, and that's where you will see more of the kind of meaty social entrepreneurship projects that some of my colleagues may also be funding. And in that part of the portfolio, we're looking for projects that are new and different, potential to be better than existing solutions, and then have a significant impact, some sort of ripple effect on the sector. It's not just affecting this organization, it's really advancing knowledge, frontiers of knowledge in that particular field. I should also note that we're a 5-county funder, and we're in the areas of arts and culture, health, human services, and education. Our corpus is about $90 million, so we provide about $4 million in grants annually. And our Barra Awards make up a quarter of our grant budget, and our Catalyst Fund makes up 3/4 of our grant budget. The third part of our strategy, and this is where we're a bit non-traditional, I think when it comes to grant makers, is what we refer to as beyond the money. So we think in terms of intentional innovation, you need more than just grant dollars in order to succeed in testing new ideas. So we provide opportunities, particularly around cross-fertilization. So we take organizations from all those different sectors, provide opportunities for them to get to know each other, because we think that, and research shows that innovation sometimes comes from unlikely partnerships. Or there may be ways that we can connect organizations to resources where they need an advisor on a technology project. So what are those additional things that we as a staff can provide? And we're a mid-sized foundation in the marketplace of foundations in Philadelphia. We have 3 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff. So those are the 3 legs of our strategy. But one of the things that we really believe is that if we're asking organizations in the nonprofit sector to innovate, then we ourselves should really be modeling that behavior as well. And there are 2 tools that Marla talked about. The terms that we use are program-related investments, which is more on the program side of things, and mission-related investments, which are more on the corpus or endowment side of things. The easiest way to think about it is that program-related investments are program first and return second. Mission-related investments are return first and program second. So these are the things that Marla was referring to as well. The Barra Foundation has started to dip its toe into impact investing, and we've done an MRI and we've done a PRI. So on the investment side of things, which Marla was talking about, we made a mission-related investment, and this is where we're not sacrificing return in our portfolio. We took $1 million out of one of our fixed income managers and put it into the loan fund at the Reinvestment Fund, which is a community development financial institution. Here in Philadelphia, it's an extremely well-known, very solid. They've never defaulted on any loans in 30 years. And we'll receive a 1.25% return. But all of those dollars are being invested in communities, low-income communities. So a place where you can actually get a financial return that's competitive and also have a positive impact and further your mission. On the other side, on the more programmatic side of things, what we engaged in is we invested in a project in Chester. So Chester is the poorest city in Pennsylvania. It faces many of the challenges that low-income communities face with education systems, et cetera. And one of the arguments that I made to my board is that, in this environment that we find ourselves in right now, we need more tools than just grants in order to further our mission in this community. Why are we only spending 5%? The IRS requires private foundations to spend 5% on its mission, and 95% is over here invested in the stock market, essentially. So how do we take some of that 95% and really put it towards more of our programmatic goals in our mission? So in Chester, there was this just really interesting project called New Day Chester, which actually Elizabeth was one of the people who introduced me to it. And it's a partnership between Devin Walls, who is a local entrepreneur and artist who grew up in Chester, and then Chuck Lacey, who is the former president of Ben & Jerry's. And they met at an event that was actually funded through a Barra grant, which was interesting. And they formed a partnership because Chuck Lacey, the foundation that he runs is called the Bard Rock Foundation and makes equity investments in social enterprises. They have a partnership, a for-profit entity called New Day Chester, where they are investing in properties along Avenue of the States to create a renaissance in the community of Chester. And Devin owns 2/3 of New Day, and Chuck owns 1/3. So what the Barra Foundation did in union with the Untours Foundation was, rather than give them a grant, we provided a $250,000 interest-only loan for 5 years with a balloon payment at the end of that 5 years. And some people ask, what is the advantage? Why wouldn't you just give them the money? So I think one of the most compelling reasons to engage in impact investing is how you could open up the private capital markets for organizations. So they were not able to get the interest rate that they would have been charged if they had gone to a conventional bank would have been exorbitant. We were able to provide interest only 4%. What this will do is position them to be able to refinance at the end of 5 years. So I think it's really interesting to think about impact investing, particularly in economic development, where you can really leverage philanthropic dollars to open up the private capital markets.
Maybe I'll turn to you, Elizabeth. Clearly, you've overlapped with the activity that the Barra Foundation is engaged in, but what are you doing at Untours?
Great. Good afternoon. I don't speak nearly as quickly as Tina. She can get in a lot more than I can. So, the Untours Foundation was an unplanned baby, an unexpected surprise. It was the child you didn't know you wanted until it was here, and you could love it dearly. Our founder, Hal Tausig Sr., who passed away last year, never wanted a foundation. He didn't believe in the nonprofit world. And he equated philanthropy with charity and not change. But he had a problem to solve. At age 53, for the first time in his life, after going broke as a rancher and getting fired as a professor, he was making money through his new company, Untours, the world's first B Corp now. And for spiritual reasons, he decided he didn't want to have any money. So he had this problem, how to get rid of the money. So the first year he made more money than he needed. He divided it up and sent checks to all of his customers. And some of them called to say they thought he was crazy, but as he said, they all cashed their checks anyway. But he didn't want to go through that again. So then he set up profit sharing with his employees, and it included paying all of them the same thing, himself and his wife included. But after the first Gulf War, or the start of the war, there were fewer U.S. Americans traveling, and Untours had no profits. And some of his staff members wanted him to take out a loan to give them the annual profit-sharing check they were used to. And Hal was so frustrated to learn in retrospect that his staff had never understood profit-sharing. And he started thinking he really didn't want to be helping middle-class people. He wanted to be helping low-wealth individuals. So he decided to sell Untours to the employees. He loves worker-owned businesses. But they wouldn't buy it. Those with seniority wanted a bigger piece of the pie. So here he was, money still in hand, not knowing what to do. So as a last resort, he set up the Untours Foundation. But he didn't tell anyone. It was his fun and secret project that he did happily for a time, until he was outed 7 years later by Paul Newman and JFK Jr., who gave him $250,000 and the title of having the most generous company in America. So he was outed, and the Untours Foundation got on the map. What he created in the foundation was in part a model of Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Hal gave low-interest loans and equity investments around the world, places he would stumble upon in his travels. And a difference for the Untours Foundation over Grameen Bank is Hal established very low interest rates. You might know with micro-lending, the interest rates are as high as 33% to cover the overhead, but Hal didn't want that for low-wealth individuals. When I came on 12 years ago, I added that the businesses we invest in, which we call investees, have to also be super green models of change. We're a tiny foundation, so each investee has to do a good job modeling a new economy and a business world that reflects climate change. We differ in part from traditional foundations in that all of our endowment is invested in these hand-picked little businesses. Hal had no idea 25 years ago when he established the Untours Foundation that he was setting up a 100% mission-aligned investing foundation. And I confess to you that I didn't know that either until several years ago when the Patricia Kind Family Foundation said to me, "Your loan fund, stupid, is your endowment." And she probably said it just that way, too. Seems so obvious to me now. Instead of using just 5% of our assets toward our mission, we're using 100% at all given times. The other trailblazing that Hal did, and again unintentionally, was he modeled a for-profit giving its profits to a nonprofit. And this inspired J. Cohen Gilbert, who co-founded the B Corp movement. That's a discussion for another day, but you've probably heard of them. It's a certification that raises the bar on corporate stewardship. There are over 2,100 B Corps in the world, in 50 countries. King Arthur and Ben & Jerry's are B Corps now. And as well, there's a generic form of B Corps called benefit corporations. 33 states have now made them legal entities, which is really exciting. We're working up to B corporations being an IRS certification, hopefully, in the next 10 years. Untours is a benefit corporation in Pennsylvania in addition to being a B corporation. Two of our local successes, just to give you an idea of what we do and who we are. One is Wash Cycle Laundry, which you've probably seen in the news or see downtown, bicycles pulling trailers. We were their first investor. I watched a panel like this, and I was sitting in the back and heard the CEO saying about 5 years ago, "No one will invest in us." And I was like, one of the only times I felt competitive in my life, like, I hope no one else funds him. I want to be the first. He's just been a joy. It's such a perfect fit for the Untours Foundation, this super green business, doing all of its pickups and deliveries on bikes, using only green laundry detergent, renting space for the most part instead of building their own laundry facilities. There are lots of new green laundromats in Philadelphia, but they don't have enough business. They have super energy efficient washers and dryers. And Wash Cycle rents from them in their off-peak hours, which happen to be business hours, so it all just fits beautifully together. And the icing on the cake is over half of their 60 employees are returning citizens from prison, drug rehab, and domestic abuse shelters. Just a beautiful company. They've just doubled in size by expanding to Boston and DC. So they're going gangbusters. A second success of ours is what Hal and I did during what we called recess. We had never taken on a local campaign of our own, but Hal came up with the idea to make Media the first fair trade town in the US. So I followed the criteria of fair trade towns in Europe It includes things like a certain number of fair trade products have to be sold per capita, the local government has to pass a resolution, and the list goes on. So we got the certification in 2006, and 44 towns have followed us, and cities, including Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and now Philadelphia. That's quite exciting. It's really leveraging fair trade sales. And now they're fair trade schools, congregations, and universities. And Villanova became a fair trade university in 2013. It was the 16th school out of now 46 universities. Professor McMenamin asked me to share lessons learned and growing pains, but she didn't know that that would take days to convey to you. So the backdrop to our work is no different than the backdrop to whatever the work you're in is. The landscape is changing so quickly. There's so many disruptors, Airbnb, Amazon, Uber, that change things daily. Phone apps, put businesses out of business overnight or create business overnight. So, for example, we're invested in a local composting company called Kitchen Harvest. If and when more municipalities vote to compost, which they all should be doing, some might go with the early trailblazers of small composting companies, but some may develop their own capacity, and they might put the early trailblazers out of business, or they might hire the early trailblazers, but will they be able to get loans to develop their capacity very quickly to be able to handle this? The answer is simple for our loan recipient, our investee, because we will make sure he gets a loan if he gets the business. But most businesses don't have an investor like us who's working side by side. So 5 years ago, I was feeling so on top of this job. I was that dog you see on the highway with its head out the window and the wind blowing in its mouth, making all funny faces. I just felt like I knew what I was doing. I could help any business. I was there for them, but I decided about a week ago that I think I'm now a cat in a car. And if you've ever taken a cat, they're designed to see a little bit of motion in a still background, the mouse under the leaf. And if you take a cat in a car, it just drives them literally crazy. And that's where I am with the shifting landscape. And that's where entrepreneurs are. They can't see where the competition's coming from. It's really, really hard for them to find a niche that they can be sure of. So they've got to be flexible. And lots of our entrepreneurs change businesses and do amazing jobs at that. So for New Frontiers, we're just working to be a model of investing, loan and equity in businesses that are changing the world. We're trying to inspire other foundations. There are trillions of dollars in endowments working against the very missions of the foundations they're supposed to be supporting. And they could be doing so much with their money, just the way Hal set up the Untours Foundation. And I want to just close with a shameless plug. The Untours business, which the foundation now owns, a model that Hal worked toward. He had a vision of his nonprofit owning his for-profit. They provide about half of our support. So for your next vacation, please consider an Untour. Take a catalog. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So Omar, GreenLight Fund Philadelphia, I know, is a little bit different in that it's not a private foundation. What else is different about GreenLight and some of the things you're doing there?
I mean, GreenLight, we call ourselves venture philanthropy, a philanthropic investment firm. And we take that approach because we don't believe in traditional philanthropy. That's not how we operate. We do believe in the language of venture capital and investing for social change. And what that means to us starts from our founder, John Simon, who a successful entrepreneur and venture capitalist in his own right, who as a Rhodes Scholar went over to England and realized that there was no Special Olympics equivalent. similar to what he was engaged in when he was growing up in Boston. And so he didn't find it, so he created it. And then he came back to the States after he completed the fellowship and started another organization called the Stepping Stone Foundation. Many of you may have heard of it, which launched in Boston and Philadelphia and another city. What he came to learn as he was successful as an entrepreneur and increasingly successful as an investor, as an early stage investor particularly, was that when he tried to apply those skills to the nonprofit world, it was not successful. He would find proven models that worked in Boston or in Cincinnati or in Detroit that he couldn't get to more than 2 or 3 more cities. And so he was trying to understand what the biggest gating factor was to the expansion of proven innovations to communities that said that they needed those innovations. So he launched something new, which was called the GreenLight Fund, about 11 years ago in Boston. And the idea was to create a local infrastructure to, one, work with communities to identify their priority areas, their priority needs in the context of poverty alleviation. Second, bring together the major actors in that community, funders, investors, other nonprofit executives, to not just identify and talk about what those issues are, but identify and work with the organizations across the country that are solving that challenge, and to understand if there might be a local fit in the new market. And then make a determination about a level of investment, multi-year. In Boston, $600,000 to $800,000 over 3 to 4 years, to help an organization come to the new city, to get going, and to scale in a way that they would be sustainable in that new market for a long term. And so over the first 6 years of this in Boston, they got pretty good at it and made a determination that they could replicate that model to other cities that were doing similar issues. And the first 6 years, they replicated to the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland, and Philadelphia, in large part to a significant investment from the Barra Foundation to get us going. And so over the last 5 years in Philadelphia, the GreenLight Fund has raised and invested $4.2 million across a portfolio of 4, soon to be 5 organizations that are working in partnership with communities to dramatically reduce poverty in the communities we operate in. Our portfolio really runs the gamut across the age spectrum. We work on and have invested in programs that do employment placement for formerly incarcerated individuals, a program that accelerates community college completion by connecting students to benefits for which they're eligible, youth employment programs to get 18 to 24-year-olds who are disconnected from school or work into careers that pay well, particularly in the IT sector, and most recently, a home visiting model to work with families to improve early literacy for their infants and toddlers. So all of these things that we do, what we call it venture philanthropy, we don't make grants, we make investments because not only do we give kind of unrestricted long-term dollars to an organization, but as the executive director, I take a seat on the board. I'm responsible for helping the organization identify a local leader, to help them build out a local advisory board, and to help them be sustainable in the long term. What success looks like for the GreenLight Fund, once a year we bring in an organization that fills a need that the community has identified for itself. And over the next 5-6 years, we anticipate that that organization will successfully grow in Philadelphia and will have the ability to sustain itself by itself without GreenLight after we step away. And so it's really very important for us, if you think about venture capital and philanthropy, we identify a need, we identify a problem, and work in concert with communities to make sure that that problem is a real problem. Second, we look for transformative opportunities where we see a problem and identify a best-in-class organization that could be operating in Alaska or Florida or Wyoming that could be a fit in Philadelphia. And once we make that match, we provide significant dollars to help them grow and scale in Philadelphia and provide an infrastructure to accelerate their success. And so we are supported by 60% of our funding comes from individuals who are venture capitalists and private equity investors themselves, because you can imagine they understand that model. It's what has helped them become successful in their professional lives. And then the remaining 40% of our dollars comes from foundations, large traditional foundations, who see our model as being quickly responsive to community need, but also being able to wrap ourselves around particular organizations that might need a little bit more support. At large foundations or even traditional foundations, program officers can have I won't call it a caseload, but you can call it kind of a portfolio of grants that they're managing. It could be 10 or 12 organizations whose grants they're overseeing. For the GreenLight Fund, we're capped at about 4 to 5, and so we provide intensive support to these organizations, to their leaders, and to their boards to help them successfully navigate the new market they're in. And so the GreenLight Fund is not a private foundation. We are a public charity, 501c3, that raises all of the dollars that we invest. But more importantly, the first thing we do, more important than any investment we make, is center our grant making in the needs of the community and build out our investments from there so that we're solving community needs that are identified by the community. Thank you.
So each of you touched on some great stories about some of the sort of new and different investments you've made, whether it be New Day Chester or Wash Cycle. Are you putting in place any more formal metrics to sort of measure impacts? I guess as you're engaging in these new and different types of investment activity, are you setting up strict ways of capturing data around impact or metrics for how these investments are performing?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So for GreenLight, part of our model is we are deeply, deeply committed to what we call performance management and ensuring that organizations clearly understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how they can learn from their process to become better. And part of that investment process for us is to understand, once we make an investment, what are the things that we're going to hold you to at the end of the first year, at the end of the second year, at the end of the third year. And we hold them to that. Our capital is contingent upon their performance in meeting these outputs and outcomes. A great example is the organization Single Stop. Single Stop has a benefits access tool, proprietary benefits access tool, that screens individuals for the benefits, federal, state, and local, for which they're eligible. Single Stop primarily works with community colleges. As you can imagine, a number of community colleges serve low-income individuals. So the partnership with the Community College of Philadelphia and Single Stop was to screen over a 5-year period 5,000 students and connect them to the benefits for which they're eligible. And over the last 4 years, they've already surpassed the 5,000 number. They're at 5,500 right now. And we know that they've drawn down $15 million in benefits, cash and non-cash benefits, that they were eligible for, that they would not have gotten unless they had been screened for the process. In addition, what we found was that those individuals who were screened had higher GPAs, they had more course credits, and were moving through the process of community college faster because they had more money in their pockets and were not having to choose between, do I pay for my books or do I pay for something else? And so we were able to get to fairly a granular level of detail for those who were screened to understand how much money they received in benefits, how they were improving in terms of completion and persistence through community college. And those are the types of things that we're tracking at a very granular level as GreenLight. And we also think and believe it's incredibly important for organizations to have the capacity internally to understand how they do that. And we help to build that capacity through our investments. So we track these outcomes and outputs very, very carefully and make their performance contingent on our continued investment.
Metrics are certainly what everybody's most interested in these days. We're working with getting a lot of advice from B Lab, the nonprofit behind B Corps, and other folks who are experts at collecting metrics. And I mean, it's like with Wash Cycle Laundry, for example, as their first investor, we kept them alive at a critical moment. And we've gone with them when they've pitched to Investor Circle, and they now have $1 million. I don't know what my role was, but I think it was very helpful in getting that. They're doing another round. So they have 60 employees. How many can I claim? How many jobs can I claim they created? So those are the questions, and people are helping me with that. But, and in a year or two, we'll have a beautiful year-end report which might reflect all those things. But for us, does the business survive? Does it thrive? Does it replicate? That's the metric we've been using. Does it pay us back? that's a huge metric that we appreciate. So that's where we are.
I would say on this, it sort of depends on this, which side the investment is coming out of for the private foundation. So certainly if it's coming out of the investment side, the traditional metrics are how much it returns on the investment. So we're certainly still monitoring that. And then the question for me is on the investment side, whether these charitable returns are added in to that traditional investment structure. We are seeing more of that, but it's less common, particularly because the other parties in the traditional investment structure are kind of confused by the idea sometimes of charitable returns and what that means and what we're asking for. On what Tina alluded to on the PRI side, that's the program-related investment. That's program first. That's more fully charitable. So there's certainly, in order to qualify, there have to be some kind of charitable return, some kind of milestone or metric in order for the private foundation to be able to account for the money that was spent and say that it was spent well, particularly if there's subsequently not a return of the investment. If it turns out that the grantee is not actually able to return the loan, then you really are looking to make sure that they spent the funds to achieve those particular charitable milestones. So I would say a lot of times those milestones are, I do a lot of work in software development, so it might be creating a new software module or finding a new government partner who's going to buy a new software module, particular pieces that show that that software is out there achieving better charitable outcomes and serving more charitable recipients. We sometimes see things like restricting the borrower's sales structure. So particularly if it's a private foundation making a grant to a for-profit entity, that's a more regulated structure because it's not a charity on the other side. The for-profit might, for example, agree to decrease the price at which they are selling their product to particular charitable grantees, people who might qualify as a grantee in the first place. So maybe government agencies in a particular jurisdiction, I could see a client asking for the fee structure to, say, be reduced for certain eligible businesses in Chester in a particular geographic area that needs those services.
I'll stick with New Day Chester as the example. You know, certainly we're looking for some sort of financial return. We're looking to get our principal back and also our interest back, which we will because that's actually guaranteed by the Barred Rock Fund. And we're looking for the buildings to be completed. I don't think I explained that they're investing in a series of buildings along the Avenue of the States where there's a coffee house, there's apartments, there's a theater. So we're looking for them to complete, obviously, those construction projects and the rehab projects. But we're also certain, and those are easier to measure, right? But we're also looking at what are the social impact. What's the social impact of this project? You know, what kind of influence is it having on kids' access to arts and culture, maybe affordable housing for people in the community? So I think that balance, it's a big conversation in the impact or mission-aligned investing world where how do you measure those social indicators? I'd say that the third thing that we are looking at, and I think that impact investors are looking at, and we actually look at this in our grant side too, is are we positioning them for future investment? If the project succeeds, can we then, are they invested in again? Because we look at that as a form of success.
That's a great segue to my next question, which I hope will be my last. In the interest of this being a roundtable, I would like to, I think we'll have time for some questions and reserve time for that. But how is that conversation with the private capital markets and sort of the follow-on investors? What's the quality of that conversation?
I'll tell you in 4 years.
Okay.
No, we'll have that conversation. I think you may have more experience, and since this is our first one,
yeah. We
haven't had that conversation. You know, I think what's interesting in the New Day Chester is that they did talk to other at the outset. You know, not future investment, but to get investors now. They talk to traditional banks, and they're working on a cash economy, so there actually is a lot of risk involved in this. There's not a lot of financial track record in New Day Chester. We were really underwriting on sort of their social capital on the expertise of Chuck Lacey and of Devin Walls, but I do think that that they're building this track record and paying back the loan is going to position them for more traditional financing.
Tell me your question again.
Sure. So I was the idea of, so many of you are partnered either through board members, through funders, with folks from the private sector, from venture capital community, and you've also sort of spoken to seeing your investments as sort of a seed investment to get some of the recipients of your funding to kind of the next level private investment. I was just interested in sort of how those partnerships are working out in our region, sort of where there's room to grow or shift the conversation. And again, hopefully in the interest of the opportunity we have this afternoon to have a little roundtable discussion with folks from kind of the private sector investment community as well.
We talked a little bit about this in our sort of preparation for the panel. I would say it's kind of slow going. I mean, I think that the three foundations that are represented here are really on the cutting edge of that conversation and more aware of what's happening on the for-profit side than sort of your average bear of charity. And on the venture capital side, I think the venture capital has its own very cohesive culture and set of relationships that has not always overlapped with the cohesive culture and relationships of our charitable sector. So I think it really, my experience is that the relationships are very specific and very based on the particular fund and charity who have formed that relationship, and that in fact across the sectors we kind of lack a common language, particularly among lawyers. When I've got my defined terms and you've got your defined terms, that conversation, that phone call about the partnership agreement is usually a very long, complicated phone call where we're trying to explain to each other what we're concerned about, and the other side is saying, that's not a rule. Is that really a rule? Yeah, it's really a rule on both sides, right? Because we're just not used to interfacing with each other and negotiating the charitable components as compared to the investment components. And one thing that I have heard sort of in the sector as I've been traveling and attending conferences, because this is a really kind of growing sector that I think people are really excited about, is that because it's very relationship based, it's also sort of dependent on your geography. And I've been told, I don't know if this is really true, but that Silicon Valley is just way ahead of us in Philadelphia. That because Silicon Valley is based in a lot of venture capital and people who are sitting on boards do this more traditionally in their day-to-day work, they are facing less sort of political obstacles to, say, transitioning the endowment portfolio to being mission related, or maybe creating a loan fund instead of grants. Philadelphia's got our own history, and this is not something that's immediately attachable. So I feel like we're catching up, but it's still really growing.
Interesting.
You might know that in Ben Franklin's will, he set up a loan fund, believing that entrepreneurship would help Philadelphia, and that money was distributed 200 or 300 years after his death, and some to Philadelphia and some in Boston, but we have a history of funding entrepreneurship. And now there's a new organization called Impact PHL, which is trying to be the front door of investing, as they describe it, trying to bring together foundations, angel investors, banks, CDFIs, others, so entrepreneurs can get a menu, receive a menu of who all the players are. As well, more of us are trying to put entrepreneurs together with investors. I have an entrepreneur and investee who develops undergarments for breast cancer survivors. And next week I'm hosting a meeting with a foundation that's never touched its endowment, but asking them to loan a piece of their endowment, since cancer is their focus, to this business. So there's a lot more happening. And the other thing I want to say, it doesn't quite fit in the question, but there's this idea that if you invest outside of the stock market, that's risky. And if you invest in the stock market, that's prudent. And that holds up until 2009, when everybody scrambles and panics and moves their money, or when Enron goes down. And one of our investments is in Equal Exchange, a 30-year-old fair trade business that last year did, I think, $70 million in business. No, $270 million in business. And it has an incredible growth chart of the last 30 years. It's almost a straight line up. And you see that juxtaposed over the stock and bond market. And there's a lot of stability in lots of the alternative investments, including I'm trying to talk some foundations that are interested in homelessness and housing to carry mortgages for housing. You know, they can have a lien against the building, they can have the collateral. You know, what's safer than that? So fear not if you want to become an investor in good things.
Well, I think we have time for a couple questions, so please, Mr. Scarpa.
Elizabeth, you mentioned, I think, a B Corp.
Yes.
Is that a tax, is that an IRS identified program?
It's not yet, but it's a legal entity in 33 states. And you have to change your corporate charter to become a B Corp. You have to say that your stakeholder is no longer just your shareholder. It's also your employees, your suppliers, your customers, and the earth. And each state is giving different benefits to the corporation. So in Pennsylvania, there's certain tax benefits that you get, but it's not yet an IRS thing. What surprised B Lab, which is the nonprofit behind this, is they thought that California would be the first to pass legislation, being about the most liberal state in our union. And in fact, it was Louisiana. And it was very conservative states. And then it was like, oh, of course, they believe that private enterprise should solve social problems. And the progressive states have been coming up to speed. Philadelphia was actually the first government to give tax benefits to B corporations. They gave them each tax forgiveness for $4,000 a year. But I think within 5 to 10 years it will be an IRS designation.
So just to catch up on that, because I do think that sort of goes to where this conversation is between the for-profit and the charitable world, and the benefit corp, from a black letter kind of corporate law perspective, represents a legally binding middle ground in between. It's intended to kind of solve the original Ben & Jerry's problem. You know, they had this wonderful company, they wanted to sell a traditional for-profit corporation. The board has a fiduciary obligation to maximize the shareholder pecuniary value. Got to make the most money for your stockholders that you can, and if you undermine their value, they can sue you because that was your obligation as a board member. The benefit corporation is an alternative under state law. It's an entirely different statute for a different corporate form that, as Elizabeth was describing, has this public benefit. It's a stated public benefit. Again, it depends, of course, on which state law you're looking at, how it's stated and how it plays in. But the idea is the directors can and must take that benefit into account, and that it can be dominant over private benefit to the shareholders.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Oh, I don't want to mediate that. Go ahead.
Is a B corporation not subject to the rules, 501c3?
That's right, a B Corp. Actually, so public benefit or benefit corporation tends to be the state statutory term. B Corp is an additional layer on top. It's a certification that you can get even before you've obtained public benefit status from this third party that will do an assessment if you like, and they have their own standards. It is not a tax exempt entity. It is a taxable for-profit C Corp. It is, yeah, so it's taxable, it's not a C3.
There's a test online at B Corp. If you have a business, they love you to take the test because they keep changing it. They're learning as they're going how they want to weight it. But just for full transparency, the test has 200 points, and you need to get 80 points to be a B corporation. And here's Untours. It's such an incredible organization. The building is covered with solar panels. There are worms in the kitchen composting our food scraps. Everything is recycled. You think it's closed when you come in because the employees don't turn the lights on anymore. And it's scraped by with the minimum, with 80 points. You know, that's how hard the test is. They don't get points, unfortunately, for supporting the foundation. So that's, you know, that's the tweaking that we're trying to do with B Lab. But it's a really hard test. It's a really great thing, these B Corps, and they would be grateful if you would take the test. There's no charge. You'll see how your business is doing. It might open up areas you see you could do better, and they will appreciate it.
And do they go to B-Lab? Is that where they would take the test?
Oh, no, you take the test in your bedroom slippers at your home office at your computer.
Is it through B-Lab's website, though? Is that?
It's at B-Lab or B Corp.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the last, oh, sure, one more question, right? Okay.
I think a quick question, primarily for Omar, but perhaps for the others. In the context of venture philanthropy, how do you just, how does exit occur? And are there others who are syndicating to syndications that are for the future in the C model? So I'm curious how that plays out in venture.
That's a great question. On the syndication side, I'll start with that. So we have what we call a selection advisory council, which is made up of 30 individuals largely. And they're from a mix of foundations and they're investors. But the power of that group is that we're able up front to have them bought into the issue area that we're investing in. We bring along the organizations we're looking at, and then they conduct the diligence with us. So by the time we're ready to make a choice between one or two organizations, they understand very quickly the strengths and the weaknesses of the organization and where they can fit in. For those who are foundations, a great example is Vanguard sits at our table, sits on our board, and they care very deeply about early childhood education. Well, as they watched an entire organization go through our process, they said, we'd like to join you on this effort, and made follow-on investments after we did of about $1.3 million. William Penn Foundation did the same thing. They were at the table, they loved the process, they liked the organization. They said, well, we'll put $750,000 in so we can evaluate the promise of the model for broader scaling later on. And so at the table, we were able to say, GreenLight will put in $600,000, they'll put in 1.3, so-and-so will put in 750, and now we have something pretty meaningful for an organization to get up and scale. We do that and bake that into our model so that we have partners who will co-invest with us and then follow on later. So that's on the syndication side. We're very intentional about that. On the exit side, 18 months into our investment, we ask for a sustainability plan. And we ask what it looks like in years 5 and 6, once our investment is gone. How do you fill that gap? What does your prospect list look like to fill that gap? What status are the relationships and the conversations you're having to fill that gap? So that's 18 months into an investment, and then at the end of year 4, the executive director maintains a seat on the advisory board for another year and a half, another 18 months, to monitor the status of the investment and to be available to the extent we can be to support them. But we kind of remain in to make sure and manage that exit process. Success for us is that at the end of 4 years, the organization is well on their way to continuing to grow in the new market that they're in without GreenLight support. But what we hope to do is to front load not just the dollars, but the management assistance that the executive director provides and that building out the board would provide to help that organization grow and stay and sustain themselves for the long term in Philadelphia. So the exit is very important for us. Next year, we're having two of our first exits in Philadelphia, so I'll be able to tell you much more about that. But in Boston, we've had 5. And the process there is, to be honest, one of them are no longer in Boston. Because they couldn't sustain themselves after GreenLight went away. But for the rest, we have successes where we can say that the GreenLight investment for them to come to the new market help them seed, stay, take root, and flourish in the new market.
Great. So I think we'll close there, and I just want to close by thanking all of you on our panel. I feel inspired by learning all of the fun stuff you're up to. And I also want to specifically thank you for being part of our inaugural panel on this subject. And we do really hope that this is just kind of the start of a longer and more detailed and free-flowing conversation. So thank you.